Okay, so I'd like to introduce Greg Downey to begin the first panel, Why Culture, Mind, and Brain. Nice to see you.
I'll make my introductions quick because I want to give all the time to our speakers. Stephen J. Heine will be our first speaker. He's professor of social and cultural psychology at the University of British Columbia. He's authored or co-authored more than 60 articles, including one in particular that we'll be talking about today, that we're all sort of responding to in the first panel. An extremely influential paper that appeared in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Professor Heine is also author of the textbook Cultural Psychology, and so after Rob, he's ideally positioned to sort of talk about this relationship between cultural research and psychological research. His research includes not only cultural psychology, however, but also folk attitudes around genetic essentialism. So I think, please join me in welcoming Stephen Heine. I'll give him his first full 25 minutes. So.
Can you hear me okay? Is this on? Well, thanks so much for putting this together. This is just an amazing slate of speakers. I'm really thrilled to be a part of it, to get to start things off. And the title of my talk here is based on the title of our paper I co-authored with my colleagues Joe Henrich and Aaron Zion. And in some respects, you're not the most appropriate audience for this talk, in the sense that this paper is meant to provoke psychology and the behavioral sciences more generally to take seriously the kinds of questions that the FPR is based on. But I hope we can have some interesting discussions about this nonetheless. So one interesting consequence I learned if you title a paper The Weirdest People in the World, you end up in some interesting Google images. This is the new cast of characters associated with Glenn Beck and I are now. But you sort of start our argument with two background observations that I don't think are controversial, at least they're easy to defend. One is that the psychological database represents a rather narrow slice of humanity. And the other is that psychologists frequently assume universality in their research. And I'll just sort of provide some arguments, evidence for this. The psychological database is narrow. Jeffrey Arnett a few years ago did a survey of the top journals in 6 disciplines in psychology to see, well, who is it that we're studying? And found that 68% of the participants are from the U.S., a full 96% came from the West, and 70% of the samples were undergrad. So when you're trying to understand human nature, these are the people Put it in a different way, the odds of a randomly chosen American undergrad showing up in a psychology study are more than 4,000 times greater than the odds of a randomly chosen non-Westerner showing up in a psychology study. So it's a really extreme bias here that we have in the literature. It's far narrower than I think that we recognize. So why is this? We can speculate, how did this come to be? And one argument is, well, maybe this is just an artifact of the success of American universities, so that American universities are able to attract best researchers around the world, and so maybe just because of this, that's why psychology has an anchor here, and we tend to study the people around us, so maybe that's why. I don't think that can explain all of this, though, because the dominance of psychology, the American dominance of psychology, is not found to the same extent in other sciences. So one review found that 70% of all psychology citations come from the U.S., and just comparing that with other sciences, it was the highest among the set of 20 sciences that were reviewed. Chemistry, 37% of citations come from the U.S. And there's no question about whether the findings from chemistry generalized to other contexts the way that there is with psychology. Another way of looking at this here is just looking at physics as an example. The top 4 producers of physics citations are in order: U.S., Germany, Japan, and France. This is all 1997 data. And just looking at the GDP ranking, those are the top 4 biggest economies at the time. So that big science requires big money, essentially. But when you look at psychology, you get a very different picture. The top producers of psychology citations are in order the U.S., UK, Canada, places out, and Australia. We're not used to being in the top list of anything here. So good psychology here requires good English skills, apparently, right? It's curious that psychology is coming out of places where English is spoken. And another point here is just that psychology is really popular in North America. It's in many universities. It's the #1 major, and that's much less so in most other places around the world. That psychology is not seen as such a fascinating thing to study or an obvious career choice the way it is in North America. And I think it's interesting to speculate how that came to be. All right. The second observation here is that we often assume our findings are universal. Usually this is done implicitly in the sense that we do a study and then we say we found some human bias. This is the way that humans think. And very rarely do we ever discuss our findings in terms of our samples. That's not, it's the exception that does this, that questions whether the findings would generalize to a different kind of sample. We usually don't talk about generalizability much in our field. Reflecting that we are assuming that these are universal, we're finding something that's true of the species. Now, this isn't new to remind psychologists that the database is narrow. This has been done a number of times before. UCLA, David Sears had a very influential paper in 1986 arguing that we know a lot about college sophomores and not much else. But we want to argue additionally here, it's not just that the database is not representative, it's often a distinct outlier in the distribution of findings. That for any kind of psychological effect, you'll get a distribution of how pronounced the effects are in different samples, and typically this standard database here is often at the extreme end of a distribution, as I'll show in a quick review here. So we call this current database is weird. Composed of Western, educated, industrialized, rich democratic societies. And the question that we're interested in here is, well, how do the results of this population compare with those from other populations? This is, we looked at a really vast literature here. We were looking at any kind of phenomenon that has been studied in multiple societies. And so that we then summarize our evidence in terms of 4 telescoping contrasts. One, comparing data from industrialized societies with those from non-industrialized societies. Another, comparing data from Western societies to non-Western industrialized societies. Comparing Americans versus other Westerners. And data comparing university-educated Americans with other Americans. And we limited this to processes that have been viewed to be universal, so we didn't include individual difference variables, so we weren't looking at where is the most conscientious place, but looking at phenomena that were identified arguably as universal. And again, we needed data from several different countries to be included. And so we summarized all of the data that we were able to find. We scoured the literature to the best of our abilities to do so. So I'm going to show you a series of laundry lists here to just talk about, and I'll provide elaborate on one example from each list here, of ways in which the weird society is extreme. And here are the ways in which, the domains in which the industrialized societies occupy an extreme position. Some visual illusions, and I'll give an example of that. Perceptions of fairness, which sort of undergird a lot of economic theory here, that industrialized societies, people expect more fairness and demand more fairness in their interactions with others, as evidence from economic gains shows. Folk biological reasoning, how people come to understand the biological world. In industrialized societies, people are more likely to project human qualities onto non-human animals. Those in non-industrialized societies are less likely to do so, and they actually interact more with animals than those in industrialized societies. And egocentric spatial reasoning, that is making sense of the world in terms of how it appears to you, whether things are on your right or your left, or in your front or in your back. And in non-industrialized societies, it's more common for people to rely on the cardinal directions for organizing their understanding of space, even when they go indoors. So here's one example then, the Mueller-Lyer illusion, very famous illusion here. The line on the left looks longer than the right, and we know now, and largely from this cross-cultural evidence, that a reason that we have this illusion is because of our experiences living in a carpentered world where we see corners that provide clues about perspective and distance. And almost 50 years ago, Marshall Segal here went out to a number of non-industrial societies to measure this Mueller-Lyer illusion here, and this is the y-axis, the point of subjective equality, really the strength of the illusion. And so American undergrads at Northwestern here see the illusion the strongest of all of these samples. Next is South Africans of European descent, and then a variety of subsistence societies here. And in the case of the San and South African miners here, these are not significantly different from zero. This is not an allusion to them. They would call it the Mueller-Lyer line drawing, perhaps. And just showing here that this phenomenon that we, very robust phenomenon, it's been an important part of Fodor's work on modularity of the mind. And we see that, we don't see evidence for it in the same way everywhere. Some places we don't see evidence at all. And it depends which non-industrialized societies you choose, too, that some of them show the illusion considerably more than others, which just points to the importance of getting diverse samples here. Okay. Importantly, not every phenomenon is either culturally variable necessarily, or is do industrialized societies occupy an extreme position on. And we also summarize those areas in which the evidence suggests that weird societies are not weird. So some other visual illusions, such as the horizontal-vertical illusion, does not differ between these groups. Basic color perception is largely similar around the world, maybe some differences around the edges of categories based on different color terms. Recognition of the basic emotional expressions is largely similar around the world, although there's an in-group bias where people recognize faces made by people of their own in-group better than those from other cultural groups. Psychological essentialism, this has been demonstrated in a very wide variety of non-industrialized societies. It looks like the tendencies are comparable to those found in industrialized ones. And then there's also many findings from two sample studies that show evidence for cultural similarities, and many do for differences. But this isn't enough data points to really draw any conclusions about how universal or how unusual the weird sample is. So the next contrast here is comparing Western versus non-Western societies. So these are domains in which Western societies occupy an extreme position. More analytic reasoning, which I'll talk about in a minute. More independent self-concepts here, the idea of thinking of the self as a self-contained unit, distinct from others, and organizing our experiences based on this independent view of the self. Shido Kitayama here has made a very convincing case of how much of our social psychology has been grounded in the view of self, of an independent view of self, and that you get a very different psychological consequences when you look at more interdependent views of self. More motivations for self-enhancement, that Westerners show more evidence to focus on their positive qualities and avoid things with their negative qualities, more so than those from non-Western societies. Less conforming. Conforming is very common throughout the world, but even more so in non-Western societies than in Western societies. There's more desire for choice in Western societies, that people liking a lot of choices around, more so than in non-Western societies. A morality that's exclusively based on justice concerns, rather than also having interpersonal obligations or concerns with purity, which are also common in a number of non-Western societies, and less antisocial punishment, tendency to show a sort of vengeful punishment towards cooperators. So here, and also there's been many two-country studies. This is probably the most common kind of cross-cultural project in psychology, is to contrast a single Western sample with a single non-Western sample. There's been many differences found in various domains, but it's not clear which pattern is, with a two-sample study, which pattern is more unusual. And so here just contrasting holistic versus analytic thinking, that much psychological research has been focused on analytic thinking as sort of the dominant reasoning style. And a few years back, Dick Nisbet and his students made a really strong case that analytic thinking was much less evident in East Asia. In contrast, holistic thinking was relatively more common there. Some research since then has suggested that this isn't really just an East Asian versus Western phenomenon, but that holistic thinking appears to be the dominant way of thinking throughout the non-Western world. Good evidence coming from subsistence samples, good evidence from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, that holistic thinking seems like the dominant way of thinking throughout the world outside of the West. And here's just one graphic with one measure of analytic and holistic thinking, and the y-axis here is how much more analytic one is than holistic. It's putting a couple studies together. European Americans were the one tail end of this. These are 3 samples from Turkey, who had a different basis of their economy. Herders were more analytic than more collectively oriented fishermen and farmers. And then Asian Americans and East Asians in East Asia were at the tail end here. And I think the evidence does suggest that the most pronounced holism does seem to be in East Asia, and the other pole seems to be European Americans. Okay. So domains where the Western societies do not occupy an extreme position. Sex differences in a variety of aspects of mate preferences look quite similar in non-Western societies as they do to Western societies. The structure of personality along the big 5 dimensions of personality looks very similar in non-Western societies to Western societies, and sex differences in violence are quite common throughout the world at similar rates of that sex difference. Americans versus other Westerners. This is what Americans look like, if you're wondering. So Americans are occupying an extreme position on, compared to other Westerners, on more defensive reactions to thoughts about death, and I'll expand on that. They have even more independent selves than other Westerners. They show more evidence of analytic reasoning than other Western samples, and they show more desire for choice than other Westerners. So with regard to the defensive responses to thoughts of death, this is part of a terror management theory, and it argues that thoughts about death lead to this existential anxiety, which leads to this defensive response to make that anxiety go away, and that people try to feel like they're more of an immortal force by aligning themselves with a cultural worldview. And so when they think about death, they're more likely to do things like endorse supernatural beliefs, become more patriotic, become more eager to protect the status quo, and favor the injured more over everything. This is a different pattern of results here. The findings really do seem to be universal. This is based on a meta-analysis of studies done in 22 countries. Everywhere you find this significant effect that there is a defensive response to thoughts about death. But it's more pronounced in Americans than it is in other Westerners than it is in non-Western samples. This hasn't been explained yet why there is this difference. I think it might have something to do with the existential anxiety that's associated with extreme individualism, that if you really are thinking of yourself as the center of your universe and are self-sufficient, then you're more vulnerable to thoughts of death and thoughts of your end. Domains in which Americans do not occupy an extreme position, the only evidence we could find is that summarized in the previous 2 contrasts. And then college-educated Americans versus other Americans. College-educated Americans differ into higher heritability estimates for IQ, and I'll unpack that one in a minute. There's even more analytic reasoning than there is among Americans, who are more than there is among Westerners, who are more than among non-Westerners. So we're talking about an outlier among outliers here. Even more independent views of self, even less conforming, even more desire for choice, even more of an exclusively justice-based morality, and even more defensive responses to death thoughts. So the heritability of IQ comes from behavioral genetics research, and typically estimates of heritability of IQ is roughly that genome accounts for about 50% of the variance, and then your shared environments and your non-shared environments contribute just a negligible amount. However, most behavioral genetics studies are done by either comparing adopted siblings with blood-related siblings, or are done by comparing identical twins with fraternal twins. And these studies have not selected a representative group of participants from the countries that have been studied, that in general, they're much biased towards the high end of the socioeconomic spectrum. It's harder to adopt a child if you're poor. And people are more likely to participate in twin studies, are more interested in participating in research more generally if there are mid to high SES. So it's possible then that the heritability estimates of IQ might look different in other environments. And Eric Turkheimer, almost a decade ago, published this paper here, where with a very large number of families here, he explored the heritability of IQ, and importantly, his database here had a full spectrum of socioeconomic status. And if you look at the high end, which is what's typically overrepresented in these studies, you see that the genotype here accounts for the majority of the variance, distinguishing the variance between individual levels of IQ. And the shared environment, those features of the environment make people similar, because it's a small amount, and the non-shared environment, those features that make people different, is also just a small amount. But if you look on the other end of the spectrum, you get a very different picture. So that the genotype activity is just a small amount, the variance, looking at the poorest samples, and where shared environment and non-shared environment contribute more so. And the rationale behind this is that in terms of an intellectually stimulating environment, there's not that much environmental variation between wealthy families. They all have access to books, kids are going to decent schools. There's just not that much variability. In the low end, there's tremendous variability. There's some families that are able to provide their kids with a really good intellectually rich environment, and some that aren't. And so you have a very small denominator here on this high end, and looking at what are the portion of all the environmental factors that could contribute to this. There's just less variance on the high end than on the low end. So it's another different way that having a narrow sample can distort our understanding of phenomena. Okay, and those domains where college-educated Americans do not differ, our best evidence of this came from a meta-analysis of meta-analyses of 7,000 studies, and found that there's similar findings in the non-student adult samples for about half of the phenomena. They converged with the non-student adult samples for about half the phenomena. There wasn't a really clear pattern there. We weren't able to discern which one, and the authors weren't either, which ones to expect similarity. Okay. All right, so just to summarize, although there are many instances of universality in psychological phenomena, there are also many cases for pronounced cultural variation. And importantly, many of the phenomena that vary across cultures here could be viewed as fundamental, talking about visual illusions, people's motivations for fairness, the way people understand space in the world, the way they think about death. And we would argue here, and this is a controversial point, that we're not aware of good a priori standards by which you could find something in a college sample and say, I'm sure this one's universal, we don't need to check. I think we have a really bad track record for that we typically do universalize. And I don't think we haven't been able to identify good a priori standards of where you should expect universality. And that you wouldn't even need to test it. We don't know of any standards, but I'm curious to hear others have some. And so in many key domains then, the data from these weird samples are outliers, and in these domains, the weird samples would seem to be among the worst samples in which you could generalize to the species. If you want to generalize to the larger group, you're hoping to be more in the center part of a distribution rather than at the tail end of a distribution. So the kinds of concerns that we typically hear with our argument, one is that perhaps we've cherry-picked those rare exceptions where weird samples appear unusual, so maybe we've stacked the deck so that we look more unusual than we are. So this was a challenging review to do because there were no good search terms to put in, because we were just really covering every phenomena that had been studied across cultures. So this is published in BBS, we had 20-something people commenting on it, and we were expecting that, well, we're going to get people finding things that we couldn't find, and finding evidence of universals that we missed. But not one of the commentators found something that we hadn't included that made weird samples look less unusual. The ones who had extra data, they were all in the same direction here, weird samples looking more unusual. So I don't think this is the case. I'm sure there are exceptions that we've missed, but I don't think this could account for the pattern that we see here. Perhaps there's methodological problems in any of these individual studies that make it appear that there's a cultural difference when there isn't. And this is clearly a relevant problem, and that could be for many of the findings that we have. Although I think it's worth noting that with cross-cultural research, the standard that you're held up to, the standard that you need to convince people with, is that your results are meaningful, comparable between the two cultures. And I would think that it seems unlikely that this could account for all of the different findings that we had. And then non-psychologists tell us this is all obvious. And it's quite strange. You get this both from academics in other social sciences, other branches that they don't expect human nature to be universal, and non-academics too. It was we had some media coverage of this, and trying to tell reporters about this was really hard because they just think, what, psychologists think everyone's the same? They think that university undergrads are the same as everywhere else around the world? Why do you think that? So I had to defend psychology. But it's not at all obvious to people who study psychology. So I'd like to consider some implications here of having these weird research practices. One is that studying weird samples limits the topics of research. We study the things that are common concerns among the weird researchers studying it. And there's lots of other phenomena that we might not even discover, important psychological phenomena, because they're not so common or pronounced in weird samples. And so I think cross-cultural research here has introduced Western psychologists to things like the study of face, or the importance of honor, or dialectical reasoning. These are some phenomena that weren't discovered until cross-cultural research was noting that typical weird samples are lower on these variables. Studying weird samples marginalizes international researchers. If you think of the dominance of U.S. psychology in particular, that most of the theories and most of the data are coming out of the U.S., and if you're an international researcher and you're trying to build on these findings and trying to replicate these findings, quite often you might not replicate these. And if you have the model of it's a universal mind, one head is as good as anyone else's, then the conclusion would seem to be, well, you must have done something wrong if you're not replicating these findings. And I think calling attention to cultural diversity here makes failed replication efforts by international researchers in other parts of the world all that more important. And I hope this will help to empower international researchers to focus more specifically on places where they don't replicate the findings from weird samples. And then many international interventions that are based on weird research, may not work well in other contexts. So people might get the case that if you build an intervention on weird research, it's just not going to generalize well. I'm going to just summarize this quickly. I'm out of time here. We don't think this is a problem really with different theories here. That I think most researchers would agree that cross-cultural data would be informative. We think it's a problem with the incentives, that we're not incentivized right now to get non-weird samples. So here's just some recommendations we would offer. This one I think is the easiest and maybe even the most important, that just reviewers and grants panels should push researchers to be explicit about the kind of generalizations they're making. Okay? Who do you think this generalizes beyond your sample? And then what kind of evidence and arguments do you have to support those generalizations? Just get people to raise the question. I think once you raise the question, then it's there for people to try to answer. And right now, I think we don't raise the question. More information about samples is needed. often we have very bare bones description of samples. We usually just report, say, sex. And having that more description would foster more meta-analyses. And we really need, as a field, to have better norms for sharing data. This has come up in other contexts now, too. But we don't share data much in psychology. This is a real problem. And this would really help learning more about the universality of phenomena. Balancing concerns for internal validity and external validity. We care a lot about internal validity, as we should. But I think people often don't recognize the trade-off that there is between pushing for more internal validity often means more studies in a given paper, and that pushes people towards easy-to-run studies. And so I think we have to balance that with concerns for external validity, and I think kind of affirmative action for studies that are difficult to obtain samples is one way of dealing with this. And then last, the ultimate ideal here is because none of us have expertise in more than a few cultures, that we need multicultural collaborations, and that we should be forming international research teams with interdisciplinary folks using different kinds of methods to get a better understanding of how things are distributed in the world. And thanks to my co-authors here, Joe Henrik and Art. Thank you.
Our next speaker today is Marco Iacoboni. Marco works across the street. He's professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences and director of the TNS lab here at UCLA. His research has been widely reported and discussed, especially his work on mirror neurons. He's written a host of papers, however, in the book Mirroring People. But he's also admitted he, quote, doesn't give a damn about the brain. Instead, he cares about the human soul and the power we have to integrate since you wrote that.
I know.
We have to integrate sensations into meaningful lives. Again, I feel honored to be on a panel with both these researchers, and it does make my job of stopping them more difficult, because I'd rather they just keep talking. So, Marco.
So when I wrote that thing, my students told me, "Are you sure you want to put this stuff on the website? You didn't give that about the brain?" And I went, "Yeah, that's the provocative." So let me tell you what I want to talk about. First of all, why did I here? Why did I doing this stuff? There are two main reasons. One is Greg. He's such an engaging guy. We had this meeting about a year ago to organize this thing. And at some point, I thought, wait a minute, did I agree to do the talk?
We were drinking.
The second one is the fact that, as Greg mentioned, I'm interested in neurons, and one of the things that we serve neurons is empathy. And we're doing work on neurons, empathy, and economic games. And when I read the previous article, one of my stories is that I really like the neuron story, because to me, it tells us that the human nature is we're wired for empathy, which is really a complete upside down, the classical idea that we're just selfish individuals that are just trying to fight for survival. But then I read the speaker and thought, wait a minute, maybe it's just my example, because in fact, even in economic games, there are striking differences between cultures. So I'm not going to most of my talk will be about that. But then I will also say something about the fact that we do brain imaging. And my main message is that the environment of the scan is so real in itself that really biases the kind of things you can do it. And that's something we should consider when we think about how we can use neuroscience together with social science. And I'll just give one example in which there are many different creative ways in which you try to actually circumvent and try to be creative and overcome the difficulty of the environment in the brain imaging lab. And I'll give just one example of the study that we did a while ago. But then I want to finish with this proposal. Let me start with those weird cells. Weird neurons are weird cells because we never thought something like this could possibly exist. These are cells that were found originally in the remote cortex of the monkey, and of course they would fire every time the monkey would grab something. So the region of the brain actually controls this process. The surprising finding was that, in fact, some of these cells also fire when the monkey is completely still and is simply watching somebody else making that action. And the idea about these cells is that, well, maybe what they do, if you use the same neural machinery, when you make an action, you grab a cup of coffee, and when you see somebody else making the same action. Then we can really bypass all the complex interface to make to understand what's going on in the mind of others. We can connect very simply and automatically to the minds of others. And so that was the main claim that we made. And so that led partly to empathy. And the fact that there were also mirror neurons for facial expression or for ingested actions clearly is another link to empathy, because we express our emotion mostly with our face. The guys, just to realize that before he became a neuroscientist, he had a PhD in ecology and studied monkeys' behavior, which is really good. Right here. So when I finally to result in was 1995, was in Prague, and he told me about these cells. I thought, well, if we have this system in the brain, of course it's important for everybody. And now it's really the properties of the cell lend themselves to be important about this imitation. And imitation is something humans, at least in rudimentary ways, can do right off the bat. And we learn through imitation. It's an important also way to transmit culture. And I started studying imitation. This was very published a while ago. And we looked into how the brain, the human brain, implements imitation, which is very complex behavior. I'm not going to get into any detail of this. And we have this model in which we say there are some brain regions that are really critical for imitation, called this the core imitation circuit. But also we know from psychological studies that, of course, they come over from the real imitation, that imitation meant that they are strongly linked. We tend to imitate others automatically, it's sort of chameleon effect. And the more you tend to do that, the more you tend to be empathic. So I'm going to show this concept in two simple slides, pictures. President Carter being talked behind his stuff. We'll get around to the talk. So this is really to make this blocker that I like that we are wired for empathy, except that these guys published that paper in this international competition. And I, one of the physiologists that discovered this is very early. It is really big in continental philosophy. And mirror philosophers of mind are very interested. So I've given many talks in American universities about stuff, often citing neural routine, these guys. They would come to me, they would tell me, your work is great, but don't cite neural routine, please. Because this, in the US, the analytical skill is much stronger than the continental. So I thought, well, I have to find the champion of the analytical skill that says something in support of ourselves. And I found this guy. And every time you show this guy to any philosopher, he says, amen. We see emotion as opposed to what? We do not see facial expressions. We make the inference that we feel joy, grief, boredom. We describe the face immediately as sad, really low, even when we are unable to give any other description of the face. It's a beautiful description of what's according to us, when neurons do. They give you an immediate understanding of what's going on in the mental states of others. But my day job is being a system neuroscientist, so I had to reduce this to how neural systems actually can interpret this. And so the one model that I proposed shows that this core-imitation system interacts with other neural systems in different ways. When it comes to cognitive learning, like behavior, interacts secondary regions. When it comes to social mirroring, the kind of imitation that happens automatically between people and it makes some sort of social group with people, then in that case, there is the interaction between my core-imitation and the classical emotion brain centers. We had a simple model. You see a smiling face and what happens. Your mirror neurons fire up, and you're making some sort of inner imitation of a smiling face. And then signals sent to your emotional brain centers that evoke the feeling associated with the facial expression. We tested that in the study, and the brain data supported it. Other people have done similar studies, and then what we've done is to study, to actually correlate brain activity with behavior. I like to show this slide because you can show my pre-builder in front of the scanner. She was 9 at the time, very proud to do this for her dad. She's 16 now, she would never do it. So we're doing this longitudinal slide that's led by another operator, and the kids are doing facial expression, imitation, observation, facial expression. And we get activity, of course, in all the circuit talking about, the middle nerves, the insula, the limbic system. But the interesting thing is that in these kids, the level of activation correlates with their social competence. We have skills, social competence, and empathy, and there is a nice correlation between the activity in these brain regions where the kids do imitation, observe facial expression, and social competence of these kids. So we kind of propose what Europeans agree biomarkers to society. But one of the critiques we get is that, well, everybody's really complex. You can't just do mirroring. I mean, there are situations which is so complex and that you can't assume that that's the only phenomenon that goes on. And that's pretty reasonable. But in the empathy, the neuroscience regulators, now there's almost this kind of dichotomy between the people that support these simple forms of automatic imitation and the people that say, well, I'm not much more reflective. I don't think that these are actually in competition. I actually think that mirrors are good. I think that they are basically the foundation of the house, but of course you need also other things. And so we're doing a project on that involves social economic games, and we want to just to operationalize this concept. And here's a project that my grad student here is doing. They just get funded by NIH to do the project. So what we do is that our subjects do our classical empathy task, imitation, facial expression, or observation of brain values. We look at the activity of the brain. And then, in a separate session, this guy goes through an economic game. And what we do in the economic game, what we do is to look at how the brain can predict the kind of amount of shade that the outsiders do in the economic game. Now, this game is a game that doesn't, economic games generally tend to have this component of trust, strategizing. This is a special game that basically doesn't have any of that. And we thought this is perfect because we have some sort of pure indicator of prosocial behavior. But it's even that, it's not even sure it's not true. Because, for instance, the guy is in the center. Nobody sees him, nobody knows what he's doing with the man that he's going to give to other people. And yet, think about religiosity. If you're a secular guy, you think you're in the center. But if you're a very religious person, you always think there's something there looking at you. Now, let me talk. So that's why I really was interested in your paper, because in fact, we really have scientists we get. And for brain imaging, that's even probably more extreme than for psychological studies, because standards are really located in special settings. And let me talk now about the problems that we have with selling. We use the body a lot. When we talk, we use the body a lot. Italians work with others, of course. And scanners, well, scanners really work well with their bodies. Because that body doesn't move. Motion is one of the main problems that we have when we do the images. And so when it comes to, if I have to make an overview of the last 20 years of brain imaging, especially with the advent of fMRI, I'd say that we can divide these years in two periods. The stimulus response years, in which, because the sound needs to be in the scanner and move as little as possible, what you want to do is percent some stimuli, you get a little response. Stimulus response tasks are very popular in some aspects, some type of experimental psychology, because they allow complete control of the behavior of the sound. You know what they're going to see, and you get the response. You can control and quantify the response. But then, you believe that can capture a lot of the things that happen in the human mind. Motivation, long-term plans. This kind of data is really are limited in the get to that. One thing that the community really hated at some point was the whole idea of doing rest in the sky. Because the idea was that, well, it's just resting. They are thinking about other things. So who knows what's going on in the brain of all our subjects? Things changed dramatically in the last few years. Now we are in the resting state. The whole brain imaging program is really doing a lot of resting state work. This is done mostly because we found that at rest there are really significant regions that are very special type of metabolic activity, and mostly because we found so much interest in the common token of the brain, different brain regions connect with each other. But in a way, there is exactly doing resting state work. If you want to do a cross-functional study, that's probably the easiest thing you can do. Because, I mean, it's not something that don't do very fast. They have to just rest in the center. But that, to me, means only that, again, we're kind of doing the things that we think are the easiest thing to do in this case. Of course, you can produce beautiful images. This an image of Paul Thompson, this right here, a DDI brain fibers. And now the whole field is going into this network science using graph theory, which is very interesting, but in a way it's limiting because, again, it's forgetting about neural systems. Like your nervous system is a specific system. It's not just the whole brain. So, I'm going to the end of my talk. The problem with this is that imaging is too insulated. Because now we can do just resting state, look at graph theory. We don't even need collaboration with psychologists or social scientists. That's the kind of thing that is coming out very recently in the literature. And I think that's completely wrong. Because I think that it's actually very cool to do it in similar work. This was a paper that 2001 I wrote, and when we presented the data the first time, it was at a meeting, and I gave a talk. At the end of the talk, Anne Fisher, which I don't, is he here? No. He told me, you know, a lady came to me, famous writer, and she told me, you guys cannot do that. You can't have absolutely do that kind of stuff. So the way we actually try to see through the problem, you know, getting the scanner and deciding about when we thought, wow, I went all over the world, and all over the world. He did his field studies, and he came up with an anthropological theory of people actually interact. The kind of relations, I'm going to do that.
Oh, you're okay.
The kind of relations that people have. And we devised a set of stimuli that would depict exactly those kind of relations. So our scientists were just watching this interaction. And we were able to sort of mimic in the scanner what an anthropologist does, to observe people and to make, actually, I'm better, I went really fast. So, the point of this study, I think I confused a lot in this study. So, they were watching videos of interactions of people. And so, in a way, we were kind of mimicking what an anthropologist would be doing. We were going to a place and observe how people behave and so on. So that was one way in which you can try to actually circumvent the problem of the scanner environment. But I think that there is a better way. Before going to that, I want to say something more about interdisciplinary collaborations. I did this paper with Deborah Jensen. She's a professor of French literature. And then we were emailing each other, and she wrote this thing to me and said, Deborah, I have to cite you because this is something that in neuroscience we never think about. The whole idea, we are so entrenched with this notion that brain representations, what the brain does is to represent a reality out there. It goes all the way to Plato's cave. And she said, well, for mirror neurons, in principle, what is a chess, is that there is some sort of ontological priori representation. And this is something that if you just start thinking about it really changes the way you actually think about the mind. Okay, my last slide. So, brain imaging is a very good thing. I love it. But in a way, we should not forget not only that we have the same selection bias that psychologists have, we have also a very weird environment. So the environment really limits the way we do things. Even when we do rest exercise, we will do well, that's probably most psychological, right? I mean, people rest their time. I like to dwell and do nothing, just think. But one thing is to do it in an environment which is, relatively close to real life environment. The scatter environment is so weird that even rest seems to me it's not exactly a rest in real life. And what's the indecent proposal? Well, the indecent proposal is that to do a true interdisciplinary work. I mean, the standards we use are standards that are made by companies that are made standards for biometric research or clinical applications. I think that if you really want to do neuroanthropological work or combine neuroscience with social science, what you need to do is to start from building standards in a different way. What you need to do is to have a team of people. It's not just engineers and physicists, but a team of people that is composed by engineers, physicists, life scientists like me, and social scientists. Of course, this is a proposal because nobody would find something like this. But I think that's the only way to really do brain imaging actually. It's something that is meaningful. All right, I'll stop with the rant. Thank you.
I'm going to try to get us a little bit back on schedule here. I apologize, Marco, for cutting off question time.
Okay.
I was planning on talking a little bit short anyway, just because I wanted to have time for people to talk. I'm going to try to get myself to 15 minutes. My name is Greg Downey. I'm an anthropologist from Macquarie University in Sydney. I really want to thank the Foundation for Psychocultural Research and UCLA, especially Rob and Irene and Connie for letting me be here. I've been waiting for this for a year. I want to also thank my fellow presenters. These are two people I admire immensely, and a paper that I really wanted to talk about. Like many, I'm thrilled to be here. And Daniel Lendy has warned me that because I'm so excited, Daniel Lendy is my writing partner at neuroanthropology, I better give my punchline first. Because otherwise, if I run over, I better give my conclusion first. So I'm going to give you my conclusion first. And what I want to do is, I want to ask, how broad of a brain science do we want to create? Just how weird do we want to get? How weird are we willing to accept? And I think to me this is the central question I'm asking. How much do we embrace the exotic in the broadest possible brain science? And it's an interesting question to ask because in some ways anthropologists at the moment, a lot of cultural and social anthropologists are uncomfortable with our relationship to the exotic. That we want to convince people that we're irrelevant. And so we can study Wall Street and we can study high schools in New Jersey. And in fact, I would argue that some of what we're saying now makes, again, the sort of core business of an old cultural anthropology, which is the envelope of human possibilities, becomes really important again. So, how do I want to start? I want to tell you a little story. This is Daniel Kish. I don't even remember how I first heard of Daniel Kish, but I remember well that I met him after he wrote to me because I had written about him. Is this clicking because I have the radio mic on? Should I turn it on? Is the click coming from the radio microphone, or does it click loud? All right, let's try it with just this microphone. Can you hear me? All right. I met him after I wrote about him, and he contacted me, and he came to Australia to do some workshops. Daniel is completely blind. Both of his eyes are removed due to retinoblastoma. Before he was 2 years old, he wears glass eyes. That's what he has in the picture. But Daniel can echolocate. He clicks, and he hears the sound of spaces around him and objects. He can ride a mountain bike. I've taken him out to eat in Sydney. It is simply mind-blowing. He travels the world giving workshops to children, teaching them how to do what he does. I've watched him do it, and frankly, I have no idea how he does it. When I've heard him click, I couldn't believe he could even hear the clicks, let alone the echoes. When I asked him, can you hear the echoes to that, he said, you mean you can't? Why do I bring Daniel up? Because his case begs the question, how much diversity do you want to take account of? Because I suspect that cultural diversity, how people learn and remake their nervous systems, is greater than any individual can imagine from any single perspective. Before I met him, I never would have imagined that Daniel could do this, that he could echolocate. And his skill is not just compensation. It's not just something that happened because his eyes were taken away. He teaches it to lots of blind people, and lots of blind people never develop the kind of skill he has. It happens in part because of a supportive environment, because of people who help him to develop his skill and refine it. So when I listen to Stephen Heine present, I really want to echo his point. By the way, Daniel pointed out to me, the graffiti has nothing to do with Stephen. I just found out that graffiti was weird. I want to really echo Stephen Heine's point in my comments, which is that I think that the question is not just to take our survey tools overseas. The question is to use other people's insights into the human condition, other cultures' insights into the human condition, to generate new research questions, to generate new things in need of examination, so that anthropologists become the water carriers, carrying back new resources to psychologists and neuroscientists. So I really appreciate that in your talk. And Marco, too, I agree that there's certain biases in how we do our research. That, for example, when you talk about doing labs, I do work on sports cognition. And of course, the funniest thing of all is to try to do sports cognition in a laboratory, where there's no sweat, no exertion. I work on rugby players, so instead we try to hook high-def cameras on their heads during games and see what they're actually dealing with in a real environment, not just showing a videotape in a lab. But also, I think that this last comment you made about the representational bias is a hugely important one for thinking about the brain from an evolutionary perspective, is to understand that some of the cognitive features that we have are incredibly unusual. Now, I'll keep moving because I want to try to get back on time a bit. So to go back to my starting question, how wide will our net be? How profoundly will we commit to an agenda of privileging human diversity first? The question is crucial, I think, because human diversity is not simply a subject of study, but also a method of understanding the human condition. We can move beyond thinking in terms of norms, beyond using methods that inherently regress to the mean. In fact, they actually sort of suppose the mean is what we're searching for, to become a science that embraces outliers. One reason I study athletes is because they are often self-fashioned outliers of the most extraordinary kind. They do things with their nervous systems that are simply not possible for other people to do. The second question then for anthropologists is, how do we get in on the party? What role do we have in this collaboration? And one area of potential collaboration for me, because of my research on skills, is cognitive science. And some commentators recently, a number of different journals have been discussing the possibility of greater anthropological input in cognitive science. For example, in a recent article in Topics in Cognitive Science, Stephen Levinson wrote about how various types of anthropology might sort of come into the cognitive science fold before he came to consider cultural anthropology. And here's what he wrote about cultural anthropology. Is cultural anthropology a fit collaborator? The role of cultural anthropology is much less clear due to the history of the subdiscipline. Recall that cultural anthropology was, in 1950, all set to embark on a grand project of cataloging cultural features around the world. But then the rise of structuralism posed a systematic challenge to such trait analysis. The meaning and function of elements were viewed as depending on the system that they function within. And I would argue they also had a strong universalist tendencies in some cases. Such holistic analysis made systematic cross-cultural comparison difficult, and progress was made in only a few fields like color and kinship. The post-colonial period encouraged severe self-censure. On this weakened foundation for a systematic science, the postmodern emphasis on the subjective, the interplay between observer and observed, and the literary qualities of ethnography came to the fore. And this is my punchline. This leaves English-speaking cultural anthropology in a condition largely unfit for serious cooperation with the empirical sciences. And I won't go on further. That quote, I put it up there because I just find it amusing. You guys can't read it in the back. The French invented postmodernism but treated it like bad wine for export only. And there are other schools that have retained an empirical orientation. I think we're fit for collaboration. I do think sometimes anthropologists need to change their ways. They have to want to communicate with other disciplines. We have to want to communicate with other disciplines. We have to trust in the good faith of other disciplines to actually hear what we have to say. And I think the weird paper for me is a signal that other psychology is willing to hear what we have to say. Because I think for so long anthropologists have seen themselves often as the permanent opposition, in a permanent position of critique of more well-funded, more established disciplines. One of the few places that hasn't happened, and I have to sort of point to this, is psychological anthropology and medical anthropology. To me, those are two of the only fields in anthropology that have oftentimes maintained good working relations, whereas other parts of the discipline have really terrible relationships with their sciences. So, embrace the exotic, exploring the envelope of human possibilities. Ironically, I think that this would align us even with abnormal psychology in anthropology, not because our subjects are abnormal, but because increasingly within abnormal psychology, there's a realization that what they're studying is not just disorders, it's different orders of neurological functioning. And the neurodiversity movement highlights this, that there are different ways to function, that every nervous system functions. It may not have the same capabilities, but it has come to its own mature state over a developmental course. So what do we need in anthropology to make this happen? How am I doing? 10:09. All right. One thing we need, I think, is a return and revival of ethnology. On first read, and I'll explain that in a second, on the first read, the article by Stephen and his colleagues reminded me of ethnology, a kind of classic genre of cultural comparison in anthropology. Some of the great anthropologists wrote ethnology. It's been disparaged by many as armchair anthropology. It's not based on fieldwork. It's the opposite in some ways of ethnography. Ethnography is the intensive study of one culture. Ethnology, instead, is this tradition practiced by theorists like this of engaging in cultural comparison, typically focusing on non-Western cultures or on Western historical cultures, but not so much on the present, to draw out patterns that may not be visible today, to draw out patterns of kinship. What did primitive kinship look like? And in some ways, we can shed those primitivist assumptions, but keep that non-Eurocentric comparison, keep that non-Western-centric comparison. The difference between the weird article and ethnology is that ethnology generally refused to include Western cultures, or certainly didn't focus on them as a sort of dominant point of reference. By shifting the center of conceptual gravity, and that's our business, that's our job, not yours, that's our job, we can find phenomena that would never occur to us to study, that simply don't exist, they're invisible in the West. Sometimes in interesting ways, they're neurologically present in kind of inhibited ways. So, if we take this broadest possible brain science perspective, we privilege diversity to such a degree that we're willing to sacrifice other concerns to explore the envelope of what is humanly possible. We're willing to place less emphasis, as Stephen has pointed out, on internal validity, for example, and to focus more on external validity. But also to figure out that certain concepts themselves are dangerous. And a concept like human nature, which almost inevitably assumes that diversity is superficial, additive, or simply phenotypic on top of a kind of universal human nature. Human nature itself may have to go away, this concept. For a long time, I think in anthropology, we thought human nature was a bulwark against racism. That you had to believe in a psychic unity of mankind, or else you're on a slippery slope to racism. And I don't think that's true. We've got plenty of racism in spite of having the concept of human nature. We might also welcome in ethnographic theory, which is currently being discussed in anthropology, that is using not just ethnological theory, but also ethnographic practice to generate new concepts to explore. Give you an example, and I'm going to try to wrap this up so we, like I said, get back, is I study the equilibrium system. I study balance, one of the things I study. In particular, I'm interested in the equilibrium system because it's such a complex system. This is a simple diagram of how one maintains upright posture. So on the left are all of the sensory inputs that go in, the way that they are matched against one's body schema, where one's limbs should be if one's standing or running. And then in the middle, what we see is an error detection. Is some part of our body out of alignment, or is something moving in a way it shouldn't be moving? And this allows us to correct. And we correct through a postural network that uses different parts of the body to keep us upright. While I'm standing here right now, my body is constantly adjusting. That is constantly making these error detections and compensating in my ankles, in the soles of my feet, through my sense of touch, through visual flow, ocular flow in the sides of my eyes, what I'm seeing move, so that, and my body has to compensate, because every time I move, a part of my body thinks that's a disruption. A part of my body thinks that I'm spinning, when in fact it's just my head turning. So this is a basic equilibrium system model. That's just prelude. But this is what I study in relationship to. I study capoeira, an Afro-Brazilian martial art or dance, which in my experience bends what is humanly possible in relationship to balance. In particular, they use a lot of inverted movements, headstands and handstands, and they do them in dynamic settings where you're not just doing the movement, you're doing the movement to get away from someone. So you have to be perceiving the other player. When you're in a handstand, you may have to reverse your direction and go the other way. You may have to collapse down into a headstand in the middle of your handstand if the person attacks you while you're upside down. So a handstand is not a posture, it's a capacity from which you can do all kinds of other things. And what I argue in some of my research is that a modification starts to happen to the postural system. Imagine this is now keeping your posture upright when you're upside down. You lose visual input if you're doing capoeira because you have to watch the other player. Your labyrinth is messed up because now it's upside down, so it's sensing gravity the wrong direction. However, you gain all kinds of interesting sensations from your hands now, which your body has to learn to interpret, the weight on your fingers. What happens, I argue, in the capoeira case is actually they're very comfortable with a very sloppy balance because they have a very robust error detection system and a very robust way of fixing it. That is, they don't stay very well balanced upside down. What they do is they recover very quickly by taking steps, by moving around on the floor, by dropping down to their head if they have to. So what they've done is they've actually modified this system so that they can maintain upright posture while upside down. And they do it differently to Olympic gymnasts. I think that's the punchline. Because Olympic gymnasts, as far as capoeira practitioners are concerned, cheat. They use vision. They look at the ground. They spot. If you watch an Olympic gymnast, she will crane the neck back and will look at the ground. And they'll use vision to substitute. And because of the cultural system that capoeira practitioners use, they can't substitute. So, now what I want to point out, though, is that this is because culture is working on this system in all different kinds of ways. Culture, not in some vague way, but in very specific practices and very specific community standards. It's acting on particular things. It's saying, we're going to give you an exercise to teach you to move around. So we're going to give you recovery techniques in the top right there. We're going to make you walk around the floor because you need walking around the floor if you're going to keep your balance. Or we're going to give you a drill to make your arms. The classic one for capoeira practitioners is we have to jump into headstands. So you're standing up and you have to jump into the headstand. The first time you do it, you pile drive your head into the ground and just about knock yourself out. Okay. But what happens is your arms have to learn the length of your head. Until your arms actually know how long your head is, you don't know when to stop. And so every time we teach this, the beginners in the back of the room, we just chuckle in the front of the room because you hear the clunking of the meat on the bone of the floor.
Could you demonstrate that for us?
Oh, I'm out of time. No. They actually made us do it over chairs. You'd have to jump over a chair into it. And honestly, it just shows that the occupational health and safety is so low. All right. So using other insights like Daniel, like my informants, I think we see vectors of diversity and we can ask research questions that would never have occurred to us had we stayed at home. Had we simply used our existing tools for examining psychological difference. And I think this allows our subjects to speak back. Were it not for these experiences, I would have thought to look at this. So to weird, I want to add another chapter. And this is my last point before I wrap up. And I think this is a great acronym. I love the acronym. I've written about it online. I just think this is the kind of academic writing that sticks with you, and it's the kind of academic writing that can cross disciplinary borders, which to me is really important and affect a lot of us. So to this, I want to add a possible other perspective, which is this is, I think, our perspective on ourselves. What do our informants say about us? What do our interlocutors say about us? Instead of us being the one to say what makes us different, what do they say makes us different? And my experience in reading about ethnography suggests a different acronym. And bear with me. I apologize in advance. Say smile. In the spirit of Stephen and his colleagues, I'd like to suggest the anthropological record points to these traits. First, materialist. That Westerners live in a disenchanted world where there's no ancestors alive, there's no spirits alive, that we live in a material world only. That for a lot of our informants, this is the thing that strikes us. And we have a strange immunity also to the ancestors, because we do stupid things and they don't punish us for some reason. Second thing is we're young. And what do I mean by young is not just that our subjects are college age, but also that we have these weird arrested lifespans, where we go to the field at 25 and everybody keeps asking us, where are your children? All right? Because in fact we have a prolonged adolescence that's built into our training, into our education, whereas our informants have entered their reproductive lives at 16 and 18. So they arguably are accelerated and we're delayed. We're self-obsessed, not just in a narcissistic Gen Y Facebook sort of way, but also in a particular type of autobiographical self-representation and elaboration. We have practices of this, not just Irving Goffman's performance of self, but also Oprah Winfrey's pop psychology self-affirmation. That we have practices of self. It's not just a concept. It's these things we engage in daily. We're pleasure-seeking. We avoid certain kinds of pain and obligation. We're lousy in the potato patches. We're lousy carrying things. Oftentimes in the field, you find that you're not very good for much, and it's a hard feeling to get. We're isolated. We travel by ourselves when we go overseas to do our research. Our subjects say about us, how can we travel with no kin? How can we move with no ties, social ties? Oh, sorry. I meant to change this. We're consumerists. We have a material culture that we largely do not produce. We passively consume most everything, not just our material culture and the objects in our lives, but even the ideas, the concepts. We are the masters of bricolage in our cultural lives and not necessarily producers. This is even children's toys. Some places in the world, all children's toys are made by the parents or the child, whereas our children's toys are purchased, and we don't make them even as kids. And finally, the one that really blew away my informants from Brazil was how sedentary we were. When I brought capoeira teachers to Notre Dame to teach, they had to invent a whole new level of remedial exercises because the students were so hopeless. And these were pretty healthy college students. And the instructor was just sort of blown away by how large they were and how they couldn't do anything. He sort of started away. So to wrap it up, if diversity is inherent and irreducible, then some types of generalizations may simply be impossible. That is, thinking about a concept like human nature may be inherently problematic, and we must ask if we even need it. For anthropologists, the argument has been that we need it because it saves us from racism, but it's hardly stopped racism, and in fact, it certainly doesn't describe the brain. Enculturation doesn't just contribute to making us different, it also contributes to makes us similar, and I think this is one of the points of Stephen Heine's paper, is that enculturation has made Westerners so similar that we don't even realize how different human beings can be. Taking a view from elsewhere helps us to recognize this is partly our way of life. We may impose weirdness and make straight structures from crooked neurological timber through enculturation. We can better see our own peculiarities if we step outside and understand that we might be a bit myopic. But most of all, this is my last point, I hope that by suggesting this, I think we can bring anthropologists together with our recognition that we need to get outside a weird population, and we can infect more researchers outside anthropology with a hunger for diversity, that this is an incredible empirical resource that we have at our disposal, that we should be welcoming in stories of the exotic, because our variety helps us see the envelope of what is our human potential, and there's much more of it out there to explore. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks, Rich.
Thanks, John.
We're breaking the session a little bit, which we're doing. We'll do the break after the beginning of the next session, which is Steve Cole and his colleagues. Do you want to do Q&A?
Well,
we have time. If we do Q&A, then I think we take a break.
5 minutes. We're 5 minutes behind right now. If we stop, we're 10:20 instead of 10:15.
Yeah. What we could do is we could do a Q&A and then do the break and then do the 4 talks after the break. People are nodding, I see.
Okay. All right.
Why don't we do that? Because I think people have questions.
Okay. So we'll take some questions. We'll turn our microphones on. And we'll take some questions, and we'll stay out of the way of the technology people.
No, they'll stay.
Oh, okay.
So are there any questions or comments from the audience? Yes, in the front row.
Hi, Stephen. Talk. I sometimes am interested in how I'm sometimes interested in how these weird myopic ways of thinking get into research in ways that the researchers are not too aware of. And so I'm just trying to ask your comment on one of the many interesting statements you made. You said that Americans are more defensive with respect to thoughts of death. And as an example of that, you said because when Americans are presented with thoughts of death, they get supernatural thoughts. Now, obviously, I consider it pretty myopic and weird to think that supernatural thoughts are quote-unquote defensive. Any comment?
Right. So.
Can we get the lights on the
So just say that the research that I'm talking about with regard to that is terror management theory, and it's about this theory about how existential anxiety is triggered by thoughts of death, and it yields this very broad array of different findings. One of them being greater devotion to supernatural, having more supernatural thoughts. And even what's interesting about what this research has shown is it's not even necessarily specifically your own God, but they found Christians at least were more willing to believe in Buddha as well when presented with Buddha after thinking about death than when they hadn't. And at least according to terror management theory, the goal here is to feel immortal, because the idea is that we all want to survive. All organisms, want to survive, and we're cursed with the awareness that we're going to fail. And so anyway, feeling immortal and supernatural beliefs have been one way of providing that, the idea, especially if you have beliefs with an afterlife. I don't know of evidence that's explored this with groups that do not have an afterlife belief. So I'd be curious to see how if they would respond in that way. The effects that I was showing was a meta-analysis for all the different effects collapsed together. So I don't know if supernatural would generalize elsewhere.
Another question.
Thank you. Quick question for Marco. You described the relative importance of visual input of hands versus visual input of the mouth, and how you expect that may have evolved and why.
Yeah, we have this theory that there may be different developmental trajectories for the face and for the hand, because with the hand you have visual feedback, with the face you don't. So we think that there may be, in fact, a different, I would say, formation of mirror neurons. I mean, we think that you have some mirroring capacity at birth, and behavior of any infants clearly suggests that. But of course, the system gets really shaped by experience. And there's clearly a difference between what you can do with the hand and what you can do with the mouth, with your face, because you can get some visual feedback with the face if you look at your face every day in the morning, but you get much more visual feedback with your hand. So certainly, that's one of the leading thoughts that we have. But it's very difficult to do developmental studies about this stuff because the markers we have are really limited. Although some people are really good work with that.
Can you say a little about the function of the mirror neurons? Dedicated hand versus the mouth?
I'd say the function is similar when it comes to certain things like, for instance, empathy, but certainly when it comes to other things like visual motor control, mirror neurons may be much more important for hand movements than for vision.
There's some more questions over here. Start taping.
I'm dying to ask Stephen, perhaps just overanalyzing the whole thing, but instead I'll ask Greg, with your, how do you say it?
Capoeira.
Performers, when they're upside down, watching their opponents, I guess it is.
Yes.
They're trying to figure out what they're going to do next. Do they tend to look at their bodies, or do they tend to look at their faces?
That's a good question. My experience is they tend to look at their bodies, less at their faces. Although there are times when they will tend to draw each other's attention to their face, specifically to deceive another person. So you'll do something with your face, and the goal is actually to draw the attention to the face. So, I mean, it's an incredibly, as you can imagine, it's incredibly volatile sensory experience. Somebody asked me, why don't you put a camera on them? I said, because it'll make you all sick. You just be ill as it sort of goes around and around, and you have no anticipation of where it's headed. So my experience has been they look at the bodies, and the faces are often used to deceive. So you have to not watch those. A couple questions. Yeah, I think she was.
Yeah, the question is for Marco. I guess there have been some study around mirror neurons and Biobe with the diagnosis of autism.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of studies, and we did some cool studies, I think, and the idea is that there is reduced activity in this system in kids with autism, and that's why they find it so difficult to have social interactions, because one of the things that this system should allow is to have a very effortless social interaction. But if this system doesn't work too well, then you have to start using other compensatory strategies to figure out what's going on in the mind of others. And that really gets, it drains you very quickly.
How are we doing, guys?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. All right. Probably one or two more. One more question.
Thanks for a great session, guys. Question for Stephen. Very interested in your idea about universals and universality and how we might come up with some criteria for defining things in that way. I just wondered, you've obviously been thinking about it.
Right.
Could you share some thoughts about what might be the criteria for that classification?
Sure. I think practically speaking, especially with psychological methods and the kinds of studies that we're running, that we'll never get the kind of data that we could be completely confident that we've tested universality, thinking about we've tested like all populations, something. So I don't think we can ever get to that threshold, but I think there are some useful sort of steps that we can take, and some that have been used in psychology for a while, such as, if you want, I think it's harder to make a case for universality than it is for relativity, because relativity, you just need a really good single demonstration that there's a difference, and you have a compelling case. Universality is trickier. One solution, I think, is trying to choose a sample that differs as maximally as possible on a variable that you think is underlying a phenomenon, and if you still get a similar pattern of responses, that's a good argument for universality. Going with large-scale, the kind of survey such as the Muller-Lyer illusion data that I showed, where having a really large-scale, multiple samples from very diverse settings. So my colleague Joe Hendrick, this is what he does. He does these 20 sample studies. He orchestrates networks of anthropologists together, and I think when you're getting a great deal of similarity there, then that's very compelling arguments for universality. But it is harder to get evidence for universality than relativity, and that's just the nature of the research question.
We've got to cut it here and take a break a little early, come back at 50. And then Steve Cole. Yeah.
Very good. Thanks, guys. Thanks again, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. That was